Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in this world of ours. I truly hope you stay safe and healthy. I'm Aaron David Miller, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and welcome to Carnegie Connects, a series of discussions on issues of critical importance to America and to the world. Today, I'm really pleased and happy to welcome back to the program Mary McCord, for a discussion about political violence in America. I won't read all of Mary's distinguished bio, but it's important, I think, to focus on the work she's doing. She's now the executive director of the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection, ICAP, and a visiting professor of law at Georgetown University. At ICAP, McCord leads a team that brings constitutional impact litigation at all levels of the federal and state courts across a wide variety of areas, including First Amendment rights, immigration, criminal justice reform, and combating the rise of private paramilitaries. Mary was the acting assistant attorney general for national security at the U.S. Department of Justice from 2016 to 2017, and principal deputy assistant attorney general for national security from 2014 to 2016. She's widely known and written in the public space about domestic terrorism and lawful military activity, militia activity, public safety. She appears frequently on the media. And finally, she graduated from Georgetown University Law School and serves as a law clerk for Judge Thomas Hogan of the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia. Mary, welcome again to Carnegie Connects. You know, I must say, of the dozens of Carnegie Connects that we've done since 2020, the ones that address the fate and state of our republic, to me, are the most complicated and worrisome. I've long been a believer in our institutions. Indeed, January 6th threatened, but we survived. I want to ask you what to make of that. And certainly an argument can be made that we've been through worse. I tried to convince someone just the other day that 1968 was a worse year for the American Republic than what we've been experiencing now. Thousands were dying in Vietnam. Martin Luther King was assassinated. Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. We had racial turmoil in the streets, violence at the Republican National Convention in Chicago in the fall of 1968. But my interlocutor wasn't convinced. No sale. And she went on to suggest that we've been through a lot, but we've never, including Civil War, but we've never quite been here today. Unique confluence of factors, pernicious polarization. Our colleague at Carnegie, Rachel Kleinfeld, has written how we've emotionalized our political differences. We've got the rise of right-wing extremist groups, conspiracy theories abound, including on the part of city members of Congress. And in a binary political system where you need two functioning parties in order to have effective governance in this country, too many members of one party seem to take for granted or are actively undermining the norms and institutions that make government work. Plus, you need presidents who can lead. And I reminded myself the other day that the founders used the word I in the Constitution only once. Someone had asked me if I knew why. And I think the answer is very significant, because the founders embedded in Article 2 the inaugural oath that the president takes. And the message, I think, was, unmistakably clear, that the powers of the office and the man and the one-day woman who holds that office are subordinate to the principles of the document and the institutions that the founders created. So let's just begin the discussion, Mary. Sorry to have droned on, but what's wrong with the picture I painted? Is it too dire? Is it not dire enough?
So I don't think it's too dire. I mean, it's not what a lot of people want to hear or believe. But I think that's where all the warning signs are right now. And one thing that you left out of sort of your litany of things that are different this time around than, say, in 1968 or in other times in our history where we've had political violence. And to be clear, we've had political violence throughout our entire history. I mean, racial terrorism and racial lynchings going back to pre-founding are the original forms of domestic terrorism. And certainly there were people in positions of power at those times that espoused those types of violent views. And the Civil War, of course, was a violent civil war, and that meant people in positions of leadership espouse the view of using violence to advance their cause. So we've had leadership that has espoused violence before, but not sort of the way we see now. But the other thing I think you left out is our information environment is so substantially different now than it was in 1968, and certainly back in the 1800s or at the time of the founding. It's even substantially different than it was 10 years ago. But if you think about 1968, I mean, at that point, basically, we had 3 network news stations plus PBS and print media and some radio, and that's where the majority of Americans got their news. Now we have not only a 24-hour cable news cycle, we have, the internet with every possible outlet peddling sometimes real facts, sometimes completely made up facts. And you have social media where people are able to choose what silo they want to be in. And thanks to our platforms that, are still motivated financially by more clicks, more time online, they feed the algorithms that keep people in those silos so that they don't hear more opposing views. They don't hear real facts if they are, consuming conspiracy theories or alternate facts. And studies have shown pretty conclusively that the longer people are fed material through algorithms, pretty quickly that material gets more and more extreme. And so I think, and I haven't even mentioned that now we are in the time of AI. So we already had disinformation. We already had just outright lies being told by, not just extremists, but people in leadership, who I guess at this point I would say have become extremists. But now we have the potential for AI generated disinformation, which it's like steroids, right, for disinformation. So I think those things seriously contribute to sort of the fragile moment we're in, because so much of the political violence, and I do want us to talk about what that term means, is driven by disinformation, or at least very far stretched information, stretched facts that demonize others, like Rachel has said, Rachel Kleinfeld, and that people then use as justification for intimidating others, threatening others, engaging in acts of political violence. That was the basis for January 6th, right?
I mean, the point you make is a powerful one, and I should have included it, because you have to wonder, is effective self-governance possible if, in fact, large percentages of the American public don't agree on basic empirical reality or the truth? Because if that is not the case, then the door is opened, wide open, to an individual or individuals to basically sail in and define the truth. And that's a scary proposition. So you raised the issue of how you would define political violence in America. I know you defined it more broadly than just physical violence. So I wonder if you could spend a few minutes educating all of us on what does political violence in America mean today in 2024?
Yeah, I want to do that, but I want to pick up on something you just said, because you mentioned in my introduction that I'd clerked for Judge Thomas Hogan, and this is back in 1990 to 1992. Judge Hogan recently took inactive senior status after almost 45 years on the bench, and he was a Reagan appointee. He was appointed a few years before Judge Royce Lamberth, also a Reagan appointee, still serving on the bench. I know both judges quite well, and to your point about sort of an alternate reality, Judge Lamberth felt it important last week in engaging in a resentencing of a January 6th rioter to really speak to this. And in fact, his words were so powerful. I'm going to just pull. I have the transcript and read from them. The court is accustomed to defendants who refuse to accept that they did anything wrong. But in my 37 years on the bench, I cannot recall a time when such meritless justifications of criminal activity have gone mainstream. I've been dismayed to see distortions and outright falsehoods seep into the public consciousness. I've been shocked to watch some public figures try to rewrite history, claiming rioters behaved in an orderly fashion, like ordinary tourists, or martyrizing convicted January 6 defendants as political prisoners or even incredibly hostages. This is all preposterous, but the court fears that such destructive, misguided rhetoric could presage further danger to our democracy. And the same week that Judge Lamberth did that, I had Judge Hogan come to Georgetown Law to do an interview and a discussion about the January 6 cases. And he said nearly the identical thing. We are talking about judges who have, been presiding over cases in the District of Columbia, sometimes with a pretty thick political valence on them, who have never seen anything like what they're seeing now. But to the question of what's political violence, I think we need to embrace, because it's important to embrace that definition includes more than actual physical violence. So when I talk about political violence, I'm not talking, clearly it includes things like mass shootings and actual physical attacks on people, clearly that are motivated by political purposes, ideological purposes. And the political purpose doesn't have to have a party label on it, like Republican or Democrat. It can be the political purpose of being anti-immigrant or anti-LGBTQ or, anti-government, for example. But it clearly espouses actual violence, but it includes so much more than that. It includes all of the types of intimidation and threats and harassment and public displays of sort of firearms and organized militia activity that impedes and infringes on ordinary Americans' feelings of safety in participating in our democratic processes. So what I'm talking about there is things that might make people pause before they go to the polls to vote, before they volunteer as a poll worker, before they run for elected office at any level, before they engage in First Amendment protected demonstration or speech, before they go to make their voice heard at a county board meeting or a school board meeting or a state legislative hearing or a congressional hearing. All of these are things that are fundamental to our civic participation in our democracy. And without that civic participation at all levels, local, state, federal, without that, we don't have the building blocks of not only our federalist system, our Republican system, but our democracy. And what I see when I talk to people across the country, elected officials, election officials, community organizers, community activists, is that there has been a serious effort to intimidate and threaten those people to keep them from participating in these democratic processes. And some have pushed back. They won't be cowed, they won't be deterred, but others, there are people who have chosen not to run for re-election at every level. There are people who have left their positions as election officials after years and years and years because of these kinds of intimidation and threats. Think about Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss in Georgia, who have persevered, but look at the intense threats that they got to their lives, to their safety. And I know so many more besides them who've had to move, who've had to get personal security, who've had to pull their children out of school because their children were being followed by people. I've experienced it myself personally. So these are things that we have to consider as part of political violence in this country right now.
So political violence, the threat over this, the absence of a sense of security is a direct threat to civic participation. And, at a critically important time in the nation's history, it's a fascinating expansion of the definition of political violence. I wanted to ask you, you've written extensively and spoken extensively about January 6th. We're now 3 years after January 6th. With perspective, with what you felt on that day and the several years after, has your assessment of what transpired on January 6th, what it meant, changed at all? Some argue it was Lexington and Concord to the right-wing extremist groups in American society. I'm not sure that's the case, but I also want to talk about the Justice Department prosecutions and where those stand. But how do you look back on January 6th now?
Well, certainly. I mean, I don't think that the facts on the ground have changed. I mean, we all watched it in real time that day, and we watched video. We've seen, if you want to, or if you're exposed to it, there are hours and hours of video that you can see of those events, and it's clear that there was a mass mobilization of people who violently attacked the Capitol. They violently attacked law enforcement officers. They purposefully sought to disrupt and did disrupt the joint session of Congress to count the Electoral College ballots. It was disrupted and delayed for more than 6 hours. Police officers were killed. Other individuals were killed. Many people, more than 140 police officers wounded. That has caused permanent injury to many of those people. That happened, and there's no disputing it, despite what people want to say now about those who've been prosecuted, despite calling them political prisoners or hostages, which is, as Judge Lambert said, preposterous. That happened, and we can all see it. What I think I suspected, and I had some evidence of before or right in the immediate aftermath of January 6th, has now been supported through the evidence that Jack Smith and the special counsel in the Department of Justice and the FBI have amassed in their prosecution of Donald Trump, but also their naming of many other people that were involved. And this is also due to the work of the House Select Committee, the committee that investigated January 6th, and an unbelievable amount of work that they did to help shine a light on what led to January 6th and what, sort of the bigger picture of all of the multifaceted prongs of the effort to overturn the will of the people in terms of the 2020 election. So that included, obviously, just lies and disinformation, that there was fraud in the election when, every court case, over 60 cases, judges threw out those challenges as being baseless. Election officials, including Republican election officials in swing states, including Arizona and places like Georgia, said, no, our elections are the most secure ever. We've done audits. We're not finding any significant election fraud. But that progressed, of course, to the fraudulent electors scheme, whereby the electors for Mr. Trump in 7 swing states, even though their candidate had not won, their state had not been certified as the elector, went ahead and met on December 14th, the day that the Electoral College meets, cast their ballots for Mr. Trump and Mr. Pence, and sent those ballots to the Capitol, to the then vice president, to be counted on January 6th, falsely and fakely. And it included the pressure on state legislatures, the pressure on the Department of Justice to open investigations, and of course the pressure on Mike Pence himself, which is maybe in many ways sort of the most significant and telling, I think, of Donald Trump's intent there, because whatever one might want to make of his words leading up to and on January 6th, be there, be wild, the morning of January 6th saying we're going to march to the White House, when you've had an election that's stolen, you've got to fight like hell, all those type of words. However one might want to write those off, at 2:24, an hour plus into the riot, when he was getting reports that the House and Senate were being evacuated, including his vice president, that people were saying, hang Mike Pence, and actively trying to get to Mike Pence. Nevertheless, his tweet was, Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what needed to be done. That is just inciting that mob to continue. And they did continue. So, we've learned a lot since then. And you would have thought 3 years out that this would just be sort of, people might have different views about the extent of certain rioters' culpability and things like that. But you would think we could have a shared view of what happened. But instead, that's not where we are at all. That event is still being used by Mr. Trump as a major point in his campaigning right now to be the president again. This disinformation and fraud, this pandering to the rioters, dangling pardons, calling them political prisoners, calling them hostages, all part of that emotionalization that Rachel Kleinfeld has talked about, all part of that trying to project that he is a victim, and therefore all of his supporters are victim of an overreaching Justice Department, an overreaching FBI. All of this is part of his campaign right now.
Yeah, a Washington Post poll indicated that 25% of the Americans polled considered that the FBI was the prime director of January 6th. I mean, again, back to self-governance. It's really hard in America if we don't share common experiences or common perception of experiences to imagine this is a pathway toward undermining the principles that we've stood for so long. As a counterpoint to January 6th, the Justice Department prosecutions, it's the largest set of cases in the history of the Justice Department. Do you think, and I want to ask you specifically whether or not you believe, after you give us a sort of update, status review, has this had at all a chilling impact on the organizational characteristics of key right-wing extremist groups, Three Percenters, Proud Boys, Oath Keepers? Has that had a chilling impact, sending people to jail?
Yeah.
With serious sentencing, you would think would focus the mind as a sort of preemptive, not just punitive, but a sort of preemptive message.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yes, it certainly did have that type of an impact. And just to kind of get some of the numbers out there, and they've even gone up since this most recent data, but as of November, more than 1,250 people from across the country had been prosecuted for their unlawful conduct on January 6th, including more than 450 who are accused of assaulting, resisting, or impeding law enforcement. I mean, that's a huge number of people, actually. And the department doesn't charge that. I mean, I was prosecutor for 20 years in the office that's handling all these cases. And, they don't charge assault on a police officer if there isn't some physical assault on a police officer. So 450 people is a pretty huge number. As of January 6th, more than 750 defendants had been sentenced for their crimes. We, of course, had major prosecutions for seditious conspiracy of members of the Oath Keepers and members of the Proud Boys. We also had other conspiracy prosecutions for members of the Three Percenters. Those seditious conspiracy charges were almost entirely successful. There were one or two who were not convicted of seditious conspiracy, but that has also resulted in the most significant sentences yet coming out of January 6th for the leaders of the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, 22 years for Enrique Tarrio, 18 years for Stuart Rhodes, and double-digit sentences for others. It's one of the somewhat rare times that the department has been successful in charging seditious conspiracy against domestic violent extremists as opposed to those motivated by a foreign terrorist organization. Historically, the government has struggled in those types of cases. I think that it was appropriate to be charged here because it is, in fact, what they did. They conspired to and did use force and violence to try to infringe on and hinder the execution of U.S. law, which is one of the ways that seditious conspiracy under our U.S. code can be accomplished. And I think one reason it was successful, the prosecution, was because this prosecution wasn't just based on a bunch of, online social media planning to do it, and then it never happening. It did happen, right? They did carry out their conspiracy, their plans, and they did violently attack the Capitol to try to prevent the counting of the Electoral College votes. So I think it was important for the Department of Justice to charge that. And obviously it was important to see that juries returned those guilty verdicts. Remember, unanimous jury, 12 people have to agree on every element of the crime. In terms of where we are now, I think it had a very significant effect on those particular groups, the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, the Three Percenters. Oath Keepers is kind of a non-entity right now, or that organization really was Stuart Rhodes. I mean, he led it. Everything they did was sort of what he wanted them to be doing. But a lot of people who had been members of Oath Keepers or ascribed to Oath Keeper views, they haven't necessarily run away from the idea of having an anti-government paramilitary force. They've joined up with other militia organizations, unlawful militia organizations in their states or their local communities. They've changed their names. They like to use names like community preparedness teams and things like that to try to brand themselves as actually being just a group of people who prepares and trains in tactics for responding to natural disasters and responding to community needs and things like that, which is sort of whitewashing sort of their paramilitary training for engaging in anti-government types of activities. And we can come and talk a little bit about what's recently been going on at the border in Texas, because I think it's a classic.
I'm going to ask you about Eagle Pass and whether the whole Lone Star campaign by the governor of Texas would be a sort of rallying issue. There was a rally, New York Times reported, but only a relatively small number of retirees showed up. So
right.
In that instance, that this was going to be a rallying cry for secessionists or anti-government forces to defend Texas against the federal government.
Yeah, I think it is a rallying cry. And I was going to come to that because I think we did see in the immediate aftermath of January 6th, we did see groups like this sort of disband at that national level in favor of sort of much more localized. There are still localized chapters of the Proud Boys that are out wreaking havoc. There are still localized 3%er chapters, but they kind of came away from that big sort of national profile. And then we've also seen, I think that there was a chill for at least a year where, people were very worried about prosecution. They were worried about going out and engaging in sort of overt violence against governments, and then the disinformation started coming out, like as you were talking about, the claims that these were false flag operations set up by the FBI and other sort of lies and conspiracy theories about January 6th. And also people have short memories, right? We're 3 years out. So over the course of these last few years, taking on this decentralized, localized strategy has been quite successful. We've seen election officials pushed out of their jobs, and those jobs taken over by election deniers and extremists. We've seen in certain counties, oftentimes it's Republicans pushed out of their positions as county board members in favor of more extreme, or I should just say extremists, because just a typical Republican is not, at least traditional, was not an extremist, but even they are being pushed out. In fact, in many cases, I would say Republicans have had a rougher time in some cases than Democrats, because they are so vilified by those in the extreme end of the party, including vilified by the former president, who calls them rhinos and worse. So that strategy has been effective at that local level, but I think we are now seeing, and we're going to continue to see as we come to the 2024 election, more of this national mobilizing. And what's going on in Texas with the governor openly defying the federal government and trying to prevent Customs and Border Patrol from engaging in federal law enforcement at the border, that is a rallying cry for extremists. And even though the actual convoy that was supposed to have hundreds of thousands of people coming to Texas sort of petered out, and like you said, only retirees went there, because one of my questions is, how do people have a week to go convoy across? Don't they work? How can people have a week to go convoy down and take up residence in Texas to stand up for Texas and the governor there? So even though that kind of petered out on the ground, on social media, it's a huge thing, right? And so not everybody knows that it petered out on the ground, and those that want to support this type of extremism, this type of mobilization against the federal government, still find this a rallying cry. And it's a moneymaker, right? Because oftentimes the groups who organize these things, and Stuart Rhodes and the Oath Keepers, he was famous for this, right? Organizing different standoffs and different events. And, people, if you can't come yourself, well, then send money, because we need that money to continue operations. And that's oftentimes what people will do. So to the extent that people think there's no money involved in this type of extremism, that's just not the case. In fact, oftentimes organizing entities are able to obtain somewhat shockingly, tax-exempt status as nonprofits, because of course they will, make up a mission and a goal that they have as their organization that passes muster, and then they can use that tax-exempt status to openly fundraise, openly and publicly fundraise.
So you think there will be a resurgence in an organized capacity of these right-wing extremist groups as we move into 2024? I wanted to ask you if by federal and state statute, private militias, so described, are illegal. I gather in all 50 states, including the District of Columbia. Why are they allowed? What's the dynamic here? Is it
Right.
Is it that they're not a serious enough threat? Is there acquiescence from law enforcement? How much do local politics play in preventing prosecutions? Speak to us about that, because I'm not sure I get it.
Yeah.
With respect to how does it work if it's all illegal?
Yeah. Well, it's a real phenomenon, right? Because historically, our anti-militia laws go back to pre-founding. There's no federal or state authority for private groups of individuals to band together and form their own private armies. That predates even our Constitution, when the colonies used militias for their defense. But a militia meant all able-bodied people between certain ages that the governor could call forth to defend the colony. And when so called forth, they reported to the governor, they were disciplined by the governor, and they, worked in defense of the county, not against the governor. And in fact, it was rebellions like Shays Rebellion and the Whiskey Rebellion that led the founders in the Constitution to give Congress the authority under Article 1 to provide for the organizing and disciplining of the militia. Militia, again, defined as all able-bodied people between certain ages that could be called forth in defense of the government. Congress executed this authority through militia acts dating back to the 1700s that eventually provided for what we now think of as our National Guard system, our actually, system of organized militias. That's what the National Guard is. But, the only legal militia is a militia that is organized pursuant to law. National Guard, or sometimes state laws that have their own state defense forces, also provided for by Congress and by state law. And so there's no federal or state authority for them, as you say. The Supreme Court's been clear since the late 1800s that the Second Amendment does not protect private paramilitary organizations. In a case called Presser v. Illinois, the Supreme Court upheld an anti-militia law that still exists in 29 states against a constitutional attack, and said that states must be able to prohibit private paramilitary activity in order to protect the public peace, safety, and good order. And as you mentioned, all 50 states do prohibit this. They've baked it into their constitutions, which 48 states say that the military shall be strictly subordinate to the civilian authority. There are anti-militia laws in 29 states. There are anti-paramilitary activity laws in 26 states. We've just worked with the state of Oregon last year to pass a much more even comprehensive anti-paramilitary activity law that includes civil remedies and not just criminal remedies. Congress, both Senate side, Senator Markey, and House side, Representative Raskin, just introduced a similar comprehensive anti-paramilitary activity bill a couple of weeks ago with civil remedies. And I keep saying civil remedies because I think one response to your question about why, when this is unlawful, has it gone unenforced for so many years? Why have private militia groups proliferated? One reason is that, most people don't even know what their state constitution says. So it's not like law enforcement is like, ooh, there's a constitutional provision in Virginia that says you can't be a militia. We better enforce that. And state law enforcement wouldn't maybe even know how to enforce that. The laws I've mentioned, they're pretty old. Again, I was talking about the 1800s. So a lot of law enforcement don't even realize they have this old criminal statute on their books. The anti-paramilitary trainings laws are of newer vintage, but still 1980s. And I know I'm old enough now to think that's not that long ago, but it actually is a pretty long time ago. Yeah, it's everything's relative, right?
Right.
So, but I think to their point, there's a lack of political will, I think, often, because when we're talking about criminal statutes that are prosecuted by local elected DAs and elected sheriffs, if you are an elected DA or an elected sheriff in an area of the country that is anti-government, pro-absolutist view of the Second Amendment, pro-militia as a bulwark against the tyranny of the government, it's a heavy lift for these folks to say, we're going to, make it a priority to crack down on these militias in our communities. So I think one of the problems has been that lack of political will. I'd say another is this is not the majority, but there certainly are some active duty law enforcement and certainly former law enforcement and former military who are involved with some of these groups. In fact, groups like the Oath Keepers and others specifically recruit from law enforcement and the military because they want people with these skill sets in firearms and incendiary devices and paramilitary techniques. And particularly for our veterans who have spent a significant portion of their adult lives having a mission, right? Being part of a brotherhood, working for what they were told was sort of the greater good, to come back to the US and not have a mission can be very, very disorienting. And I know that from talking personally to them. And so sometimes it can be very attractive to align with or even form their own private militias and tell themselves that they're doing something that's important because, if they consume disinformation about the federal government being, tyrannical or crushing your freedoms or infringing on your freedoms and things like that. And if they buy into some of the disinformation that's peddled by people like Donald Trump and others, other propagandists, this can give them that mission. So I think that is also a problem. And then I will also honestly say, it's dangerous sometimes to crack down on militias. Think about the standoffs. We can go all the way back to standoffs at like Ruby Ridge and Waco, but even more recently, standoffs at Bundy Ranch in Bunkerville, Nevada, where you had the Federal Bureau of Land Management trying, after decades of trying to get Cliven Bundy to pay taxes for grazing his cattle on federal lands, they finally moved in to physically remove those cattle. Cliven Bundy called militias, private militias, not the lawful kind, from across the country who came. They came heavily armed. They surrounded the federal agents. They had their guns trained on them, including snipers up on a highway overpass. And the federal government had to back down because of the danger that this would have become a bloodbath. So there's that aspect too, which is one reason I think that civil enforcement mechanisms, the ability to seek injunctions against these groups in court, that can result in potentially forfeiture of profits and of their materiel, that might be a more effective means of trying to combat this threat. Because this threat, we saw it materialize in a big way in 2020, not just on January 6th, but in armed assaults on state houses in opposition to public health measures due to COVID, armed, taking to the streets supposedly to combat Antifa and Black Lives Matter protesters in the summer after George Floyd was murdered, taking up and usurping the role of law enforcement, oftentimes protecting businesses, protecting other places where they have no authority to act as law enforcement. And then, of course, we saw them on January 6th. So, that, and they've been active at the border all along. I mean, they never stopped their activity there. Oftentimes, taking migrants into custody, holding them with no authority whatsoever to do that. And so what I fear right now with events like this rally that might have kind of fizzled on the ground, it's a way for all kinds of the same folks we saw come together in 2020, right? Militia groups, but also white supremacist groups, neo-Nazi groups, conspiracy theories, accelerationists, neo-Confederates. These are rallying cries for them to join forces. And that's what was so dangerous about 2020. And so that's where I fear we may be, moving into a sort of a repeat of that cycle.
Well, I was going to ask you, 3 years on, anticipating what may be among the most consequential elections in modern American history in 2024, November 2024, are we better off as a consequence of all of the work that's been done, all the preemption, all the prosecutions, all of the safeguards, are we better off first on the issue of a organized effort on the part of discrete right-wing groups who are well-armed, well-organized, well-trained to act against the federal government or state governments or polling sites as 2024 moves forward? I mean, 2020 was among the most safest and secure elections probably in American history. So, I mean, how great is the threat? First, on the issue of organized militias, and then we're nearing the end of our time. What really concerns you most? We could talk for another 3 hours about hypotheticals and contingencies in the event the presumptive Republican nominee, regains the White House. But between now and 2024, that's the period I'm interested in. Both in terms of organized right-wing extremist groups, and there is left-wing extremism as well, and we talked about. Maybe you could spend a minute talking about that. But what are your real concerns? In now and 2024.
So in terms of are we better off? I mean, we are a country that still has the rule of law. And so accountability is important. And I think it's been critical to sort of trying to restore, faith in our institutions, although I know some people would say I have no faith in our institutions, that we hold people accountable. But it can have a negative side effect because it, again, provides this rallying cry for those who are inclined to believe the disinformation that the Department of Justice is weaponized, that these people are political prisoners. So it can have that effect of mobilizing people as well. I don't think it's a reason not to do it, because when you give up on holding people accountable, I mean, then you just don't have any rule of law at all anymore. In terms of our resiliency for elections, I mean, you're right. 2020 ended up being one of the most safe and secure elections. A lot of people did hard work to ensure that. And certainly we learned from it, right? Mm-hmm. So election officials, public safety officials, and this is at multiple levels, that precinct level all the way up to the state levels, they know they've been through this before. And so we've had time, and I've been out engaging with officials. I've had a series of political violence convenings across various areas of the country where we've brought together election officials at every level, along with public safety officials, to help talk about the threats, talk about legal options to address these threats, practical options, things like safety and security at the election ballot counting locations, so that people can, come in through a back door if there's a militia at the front door, so that lunch can be delivered, like things that you wouldn't even think about that are just very practical on the ground kind of ways to protect people's safety and protect the integrity of our elections. So I think the good news is people have learned from that. People are getting prepared now, and they're getting prepared early. One of the things I'm the most worried about, though, is AI-generated disinformation. We saw already in New Hampshire a robocall that went out to thousands of people that sounded exactly like Joe Biden, telling people, don't vote, save your vote for November. We know, and I've been exposed to other presentations from other organizations who spend all of their time studying this. I've seen examples of what AI can do. I've seen that example of Joe Biden, but with the video too, that looked just like him, sounded just like him, saying as a public service announcement, due to technological difficulties across the country, I've ordered the election to be extended for 48 hours. Imagine if that goes out and people believe it. So I think one of the biggest, and this is not so much about political violence, right? But one of the biggest challenges for 2024, the election, is starting now to create a network for where people in communities can go to get reliable information. And if they get a robocall, or they get a letter, or they hear something that they think, that seems kind of weird, that they can figure out and verify, is this true that the election has been extended for 48 hours? No. But also where they can go to get reliable information about their elections, because this is going to be a huge problem this year.
Yeah. As we close, I'm thinking about just people. The period November 2020 to through January 2021 really in the end depended on humans, Americans, public servants, civil servants, who were willing to stand up, do the right thing, and defend the system. Democracy Forward just came out with a wonderful report. It's very concerning on threats to our civil service. In the end, it really, again, will, I think, depend on public servants, civil service, selfless humans who care more about the country and stand up, and obviously people who are civically engaged and who vote.
100%. I'm with
simple,
you.
Mary, but so fundamental and so profound. I want to thank you so much for this has been an extraordinary session. I mean, the amount of information of 411, I'm dating myself now, that you've conveyed is really quite remarkable, and the work you do is extraordinary. And thank you so much for coming, and maybe you'll come back again.
Sure. Thank you
to see where we stand.
Yep. I hope we're standing.
We will be. Of that I actually am absolutely confident. But Mayor McCord, thanks so much again. Take care. Bye-bye.